Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Another episode of the modern mobile oil field has arrived, and if you purchased a copy of Bits, Bytes, and Barrels, you may be a little bit confused as to why this episode exists. Well, we only briefly brushed over just the surface of Chapter 2 of Jeffrey's book, so there are still 4 other chapters for you to experience, and like in the case of this episode, a whole world of digital tech topics to further dissect. Also, before we get into it, I really do recommend you check out the YouTube channel. I know episode 1 featured a rather dimly lit Tavis and a camera that was far too close to my face with absolutely zero editing, but we've come a long way in the series thanks to Jeffrey's help, and we've incorporated more and more visual aspects every episode, and even we've tried to build a slide deck this episode. So you can just listen to the podcast, but I think you're going to be missing out on lots of the conversation, and it won't be nearly as entertaining. But that's all for housekeeping, and it is time we get into the meat and potatoes of this interview. Jeffrey, are you still with us, or have I put you to sleep at this point?
I'm still all here and in one piece. So yeah, no sleeping for me.
Perfect. All right. So for those of you who read the title, you know today we are talking about the data monster. We've got this big, intimidating beast that we're trying to conquer. And first, I'd like to start with the importance of data quality. So first things first, many more machines and sensors are being added to every part of an organization, and we're just generating massive amounts of data. The further we progress into the modern era, how has this type and volume of data changed over the last few decades?
Well, it's changed dramatically just between, and this is just an estimate of volume of data, but between 2019 and 2025, it's estimated that the volume of data stored and recorded will grow by 400%. And in 2018, the world purchased something in the area of 800 billion gigabytes of disk storage. Yeah, I mean, it's phenomenal. A single square inch of disk platter now, like just storage space, a single square inch can store 1,000 gigabytes of data. So the storage technologies, the amount of data we can cram onto a tiny little square, the sheer amount of storage being purchased is just skyrocketing. So, and that there shows no end in sight. And along with that sheer volume of data, the range of data being captured and stored is going up. Photographs, videos, sound, podcasts, meeting recordings on Zoom. Like the range is also dramatically changing. And as we add more and more sensor technology into the world, the billions and billions of connected devices, we continue to accumulate phenomenal quantities of information.
And then, of course, we've got, like you mentioned, huge volumes, different types. But what about the quality of this data? This is the modern mobile oil field, after all. We're trying to put it to work for us. How does the quality play a role in just analytics or even in organizations' decision-making?
Well, data quality is actually quite critical, and we can see this in our political world where the reign of alternative facts has actually distorted quite dramatically the world into parts that believe one set of facts and the part that believes another set of facts. And so in the business world, we don't have a lot of room for alternative facts. Either the machine is on or it's off. And so we can't have in an industrial setting, we are highly reliant on the quality of information so that we can make effective decisions. So the quality is really, really critical. You can imagine a day where, in a autonomous driving world, as just an example, the chaos that would ensue if the sensors on a car were unable to detect or couldn't pick up or wouldn't react to a visual stop sign. If it said, "Oh, I don't believe that's a stop sign. I think it's a yield sign, so I'm just going to ignore it, and I have the right of way because it's under the driving rules. I don't have to yield." In this instance, well, we'd have chaos. So we can't tolerate that in an industrial world. So data quality, particularly as we get into the world of robots and autonomousness, is going to have to be very, very, very high.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, huge implications for the entire world. But what are the greatest impacts that will come from data quality with respect to the way it will affect the digitization and implementation of new tech within the oil and gas sector?
Well, just using a simple example from an experience I'm aware of with a Calgary company, and so there was the situation here was the calculation of a royalty, and the royalty was based on the volume of product that was being produced by this producing well. And so there was a pump that was pushing the product to the surface, and then there was a gauge there that was measuring how much volume of petroleum crude oil was flowing out of that particular well. And the tolerance acceptable in the industry at a mechanical level is plus minus 5%. And but that's, when you start thinking about it on a very macro level, plus minus 5% is a very, very that's a big range. Like imagine if you were flying an aircraft and the pilot said, I'm going to be plus minus 5% on touchdown here. I might miss the runway by 5%. We'll be okay, right? No, that wouldn't be tolerable. So we have built into oil and gas all kinds of variables and variances that have historically been very acceptable in what I would call a human-based mechanical world where we can make all kinds of adjustments. But when we move to a world that features a lot more autonomousness, that variability is actually quite a problem because it affects all of the downstream processes and the accounting and the financial value that ensues from data. And that's just one example. This repeats itself over and over again throughout the sector.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you mentioned the aspect of moving into the future. So for oil and gas, what kind of existing data does oil and gas have that would actually be considered relevant and therefore be worth preserving and digitizing as they move forward? Or is there a lot of junk that we even need to get rid of too?
There's quite a bit of junk, actually. Data without context isn't very useful. So you have to preserve the context where the data was sourced, so that you can use it and treat it within a range of or a situation where you can say that context is the same as this context. Therefore, the data I have from that context is a reliable indicator, may be useful in this context. Absent the context, you have a problem. And a great deal of data that we store in life in general lacks that context. So there's the first challenge is the setting and the context within which the data was collected. Second is if the devices themselves were not reliable or they weren't tuned correctly to collect information, or if the information was subject to a lot of manual manipulation, so you could change it quite a bit, then you really got to question whether or not there's a lot of value in keeping that. I tend to look at in paper records or manual records, data that is consulted frequently. That kind of data becomes or information asset is something that could really benefit from digitization. And a good example of that are contracts. You sign a contract with a supplier in oil and gas to do a service, and if you're constantly going back to the contract to read the terms to see what the agreement was, even if it's just once a month, that contract becomes something that could really be a benefit from being put into a more digital state.
And then we've looked at things from a very, very large scale level, but I'd like to break down into the nitty gritty, if you will, as we move forward, starting with two terms that often get used interchangeably and incorrectly, those being large data and big data. Would you be able to put an end to the misconception and break down those two terms?
Yeah, for sure. So the way to think about large data and big data is in the range and types of data that are incorporated in that. So the way I think about big data is that large data and big data. Large data relates to imagine a super large spreadsheets or very large data sets, but they're well organized, they're well structured. Think of a spreadsheet with lots of rows and columns, where you get into the billions and billions and billions of rows. The columns are all well understood, but it's just the sheer number of rows creates the processing challenge of how do you process or absorb all of that information. And so that's when I think of data, that's what I call large data. Now, when we talk about big data, that's where the range of data is considerably greater. So in you think about a social media profile, for instance, or if you're Facebook and you're processing all of the information coming in, you've got photos, you've got videos, you've got metadata, you've got commentary, you've got social media posts. These are all very, and they're very, some of them are quite squishy, like it's if you look at a social media post, you have to interpret it to go, well, what's the emotional tone here? And what's it really talking about? Is there hidden meaning? This data is much harder to kind of process in a systemic way. And the range can be huge, can be very, very dramatic. And so when we talk about large data, we talk about these sort of fixed and coherent data sets. When we talk about big data, we talk about this huge mess of stuff that's much, much harder to process and figure out, where are the, quote, the hidden truths.
And then, as I'm sure we've all learned by this point in the modern mobile oil field, oil and gas as an industry isn't usually the first mover for implementing digital technology. So I'm sure there are still plenty of people in that large data sector. So what are the current trends in oil and gas for dealing with these huge quantities of data, especially for preparing systems that require large volumes of quality data like AI and machine learning?
Well, the first challenge, of course, is when you think about for an application where it's machine learning or artificial intelligence, is where did the data come from that you wish to push into these engines for processing? And so, of course, if it's historical data, and that data is a spreadsheet somewhere, has come out of a historian, then your first challenge is the sheer volume of it. So it's a lot. Secondly, sometimes machines, you get a tiny voltage shift somewhere in your mechanical process, and the data that you're going to record will have this little spike in it because it's so that. So you have to find and remove all of those curious little outliers that are actually not true indications of say, a process integrity, but much more related to an environmental effect, like a voltage ping. And so you have to kind of sweep your data out of that noise. Otherwise, you end up, you can imagine if you have a data set with a couple of outliers, it can skew your analysis towards your outliers. And what you want to do is remove those first. There's your first challenge. How do you identify and remove the outliers without distorting the balance of the data? Mm-hmm. That's a challenge. Then how do you, when you bring in your data, how do you bring it in and ingest it and massage it so that it can fit the needs of your artificial intelligence engine? It's another challenge. You have to go through this ingestion process and a massage process to take the data and make it fit. And there are a number of mathematical techniques, proven techniques to do this. To ensure that your data is not distorted in the process of even moving it into your analytic engine. And so when people are data scientists are working in these problems, these are just a couple of examples of the sorts of things they have to be thinking about. It's just not so simple as, oh, I'll take the spreadsheet and drop it into my engine and I'm good to go. No, there's usually a bit of manipulation and massaging and some mathematical processing you have to go through.
Yeah, definitely a lot of effort goes into refining that data, but are all data systems equally sensitive to the quality of the data? I mean, in more relaxed terms, can I feed low resolution and potentially incorrect data into one system, but up my standards when feeding it into another?
There are some systems are going to be extremely sensitive to quality, and so the short answer is no. You simply can't be feeding junk through. And you can imagine, take a nuclear reactor. If you've got some data coming out of a temperature gauge, it's got to be accurate. Like you can't be sending nonsense into that kind of processing engine. The risks are simply too great. Mm-hmm. But there are other processes where, it's actually it's not such a big deal if it's off a little bit. So an example of that is take a mapping application where you're doing a map. If you're just planning your journey to, from say, you want to travel from New York to San Francisco, do you really need to know every square foot of your journey? Or do you just go, I'm going to take Highway 95 and the interstate system and I'll be there? How precise do you really need to get? So the answer is no, not all decisions and all processes have to have the same precision of data. I think of your pilot flying that airplane, you don't want to be plus minus 5% on landing. Mm-hmm. No, you want to be precise. You can't have a pilot saying, we might more or less get to Memphis today. No. I bought a ticket to get to Memphis. You got to get me to Memphis. Same thing in many systems. They can, the altitude the pilot is flying at may be important for him. In terms of fuel consumption, But do the passengers care? It's not really. So same thing with many systems. They're going to be pretty insensitive to some data, and they're going to be very sensitive to others. And the trick is to know which is which.
Clearly, some systems very sensitive to that, but also human error. Does that ever play a significant role when we deal with this data, or is it sometimes better to have a pair of two organic eyeballs going through everything?
Yeah, sometimes it's very true. If you think about certain applications where you want a set of eyes on things, certainly processes which are what I would call early stage in terms of automation, you'll definitely want a pair of smart eyes staring at it to make sure that it's working correctly. So, as an example, imagine you've invented a robotic process to take say inbound transactions into your business, field tickets from the field in oil and gas. And so your robotic process tool takes in these tickets and picks the relevant data off the ticket to populate your accounts payable engine so that you can properly pay your supplier. And the first time you do this, if you haven't programmed the RPA just correctly, it might misallocate the costs. It might send the invoice fees or the payments to the wrong supplier. So you want a set of eyeballs staring at that as you first program it out to make sure that it's correct. But once it's run several thousand iterations and it's doing fine, that's the sort of thing you kind of go, all right, let's just step back and we'll react only to the things that are true variances from what we think it should do.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you're mentioning more and more applications to business specifically. And has data transformed the way companies report to investors and lenders? I mean, I don't mean to insult the bigwigs of the 1800s and the 1900s, but I imagine a lot of their decisions were made very differently than we do today, thanks just so, like you say, the pure volume and eventual quality of data that's being reported.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. The original financial statements that may have been provided, back in the early days of my career, I remember where if you're implementing a financial system, the data of which would go to your investor. If you're implementing a financial system, you were very happy if you could get to a 90-day close. You could close the books in once a quarter. Wow, that's pretty good. But as we put in enterprise tools, that close moved up to a 30-day close, to a 1-week close, and now it's same day or near instant. And so the investors are getting highly reliable, very fast data about business performance that is much more reliable than it had been in the past and wasn't subject to nearly as much manual manipulation. So are they getting better quality data? Absolutely. Are they getting different kinds of data? Well, let's just think about environmental, social, and governance measures now. Those are now coming out as part of your financial stewardship. Your risk analysis, your forward projections are now subject to all kinds of additional processes internally to kind of move them forward. So yes, investors are definitely benefiting from this wave of drive to get to higher quality financial information.
And then certainly all of this data is playing such a huge role in the way systems, people, and processes change and evolve. But where do we grow from here? Will there be another evolution in the way we collect and manage this data? Or is it just going to continue down the road of getting more and more of it? And then the points of resolution become finer and finer. I mean, is there another evolution, another point, or is it just standard growth?
No, I personally believe that we are running at the edge of the ability of many organizations to manage their data sets and their data holdings. And you can personally experience this. I mean, if I pop open my mobile phone right now and I look at the number of photographs I've accumulated over the years, and the phones they provide you great tools to organize those photos. And the same thing in business, you can organize your data in a variety of different ways. But we tend to accumulate and not get rid of these kinds of data points in our personal lives. It's the same thing in business. And so the tools we use to manage ever-growing mountains of information are themselves going to have to evolve. And of course, the role in that, you can see it already in artificial intelligence tools, like in our photographs. Our AI tools can now go through the photographs and pick out all the photos where a certain person appeared. That's an AI application, recognition technology. Imagine bringing that technology into your business context where you can begin to search for relevant documents historically that meet certain sets of criteria. That kind of smart assistant or AI-enabled assistant on top of all of your data holdings, I think is where this has to go, just so we can cope with the volumes.
Mm-hmm. And then, as we've talked about both business and big data at this point, I'm curious to see if we will ever see an age of data coordination. I mean, of course, in the past, it's been nice to have a secret sauce, if you will, a sort of data set or trend that your organization observed, acted on, and protected. But I'm feeling that if we can pool all of this data and make use of big data to analyze it, there could be a benefit, could there not?
Oh, there would definitely be a benefit, but there's also some significant trade-offs there. If you're and I'll use a technology supplier of some kind to any industry, not just oil and gas, but what makes your product differentiated could very well be the data that your technology captures and processes and presents to your customer. Kind of a Tableau or a dashboard setting. Why, if that's your differentiating feature, why would you share that or coordinate that with your competitors? Very good question. You need to have a good, solid thinking around how you're going to generate value from that process if you do that. So that's your first barrier. It's this natural tendency to see this as a competitive problem. But there are movements in oil and gas to get beyond this in some critical ways. In the United States, for instance, in Houston, there is a movement called the Open Subsurface Data Universe. It's a collection of companies who are all involved in either collecting, managing, or dealing with subsurface data about reservoirs. And this movement is working hard to find ways to standardize the understanding of that data, because it enables businesses in the industry to buy and sell those resources much more easily. If you just got a map out of Midland, Texas, you just sort of go to Google and zero in on Midland, Texas, and then just scan around. You can see all of the oil and gas wells down there. And the problem is, if you then overlaid a map of who owned what, it's highly fragmented and very costly to run it that way. So the OSDU is working to figure out how do we make it easier for companies to buy and sell these assets so that they can aggregate and build larger commercial properties, which are more economic. And how do you get there? You've got to standardize the data. Otherwise, you can't easily figure out the valuation of those resources.
And I like that vision of the harmonious future, but it's time we get into the actual monster of this episode, so we understand how we are absolutely swimming in this data and what can be afforded when we finally do tame it. Where are the easiest places to start with this data?
Well, I think the easiest place to begin is probably in the cleaning up the data assets that you have. Let me pull up a slide to kind of illustrate what this means. So we have some of the many challenges of dealing with, call it the data monster. Where do you begin? It starts with having an understanding of what the data assets are that you actually have, and trying to decide and determine where there is value. So once and a good example of this, let's imagine you're buying a company. And coming along with that purchase is the historic emails that have gone on or that are part of that transaction, or the data sets that are on the computerization of that particular company. There's going to be a lot of what I call redundant data, obsolete data, trivial data. And so certainly one of the things you want to do is begin to identify where and I call it rot, where the rot is in this data, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, and figure out how do you clean that up and how do you get rid of it. That's a major move that companies typically have to tackle. Another challenge in here is, and I'll go back to paper contracts as an example. You buy a company, it comes with filing cabinets of paper contracts. So what do you do with those? There was a Husky energy company here in Calgary purchased a U.S. oil refinery a couple of years ago. I remember talking with the manager who bought the refinery, and I said, "So what's happened? How are you handling the data that's coming across?" And he said, "Oh, that's going to be 2 containers of paper." 2 40-foot containers of boxes of paper describing that
Shipping
oil refinery.
containers, not just a box.
No, shipping containers. I mean, 40-foot sea cans. This is what's going to show up at close with all of the historic records about that asset. You got to believe, one, there's lots of redundant and trivial nonsense in there. Some of the reports are going to be clearly obsolete because they will describe an asset that's part of the refinery which no longer exists. And then what do you do with that data? Do you scan it all in and process it? I remember the conversation with them, and the answer was no. We don't. Why would we scan in stuff we don't know whether it has any value? So we're not going to do that. And so the tendency in this industry is not to proceed with kind of handling that taking on that scanning task as being a low value activity. So the key here is to identify where there is likely value and then proceed. I'll draw a distinction though, to compare Woodside Petroleum in Perth to Husky in their oil refinery. Woodside scanned in all of the legacy documentation it had accumulated over the years related to the Northwest Shelf and put that into an IBM Watson accessible database so that they could query the database to find the documents. I'm pretty sure they would have in the process of, I haven't asked them this, but I'm pretty sure in the process of setting up that database, they would have figured out, okay, scan this document, but don't scan this one, and get down to a reasonable number. But once you've reached that sort of stable point where you've dealt with the historic data, then scanning documents in and just putting them into the repository seems to be the pattern that most organizations then follow. And then that, of course, raises the further question: how do you then keep on top of this ever-growing pile of information?
Yeah, and then so now we've gotten rid of the muck, the scum, the rot data that we didn't want. So how do we get everyone onto the same page when looking at all of the available data? This seems like a difficult task, especially when you have 2 shipping containers and you choose, maybe we will identify what's relevant. Even between groups in the same organization, what must be identified to ensure that the data being used can be translated across the entirety of organizational systems?
Oh, that's a really good challenge of all the stuff that you need to be worried about. Let me sort of dig into this as a kind of an interesting way to consider it. Let's imagine you have processed, you brought in all of this data, and you want to get everybody onto the same page of how they use it. So part of the challenge is some of the data that you may have collected will have a variety of different collected over time by a variety of different people and a variety of different processes, and sometimes without even the basic rules in place to govern that data. And here's just a fun example. You go into your computer system and where you have recorded the name of the company you're doing a counterparty you're doing some transactions with. In the case might be BP. Well, how was that put into your system? Was it put in as British Petroleum? Was it BP no periods? Was it BP with a space in between? Is it British Pet? Is it BPX, the stocks and market symbol? Is it BP PLC, the registered entity on the from a corporate standpoint? And taking that even further, was it BP Texas, BP in Colorado? Was it BP Canada? Is it BP South Africa? And what's the relationship between all of these companies? So that when you say, well, I want to show me the totality of my involvement with BP, they all roll up correctly. When you start digging into data in systems, what you find is this what we call this metadata about the data. So I'm going to keep company name. Well, these are the only permitted ways that I can record company name. And very often that metadata is not well thought through. So you end up with this phenomenon. You have the sum of the data captured, company name, and it's all over the map, so you can't sort it or find it correctly. And then in other cases, the real information you want might in fact be buried in the data itself. So here's our interesting example, a picture of you, Tavis. That's how Apple is accessing the photographs. It knows the metadata is Tavis, your name, but the actual data that it knows that it's you is actually embedded in the picture. It uses facial recognition to find you. This level of sophistication is real, and it's coming hard. And many cases, the historic data assets in oil and gas are simply not ready to cope with all of this change.
And then gotten rid of that terrible data. We found out how to secure metadata to work the data monster for us and reduce it from a snarling beast into just a slightly intimidating bit. Are there any resources available to organizations cleaning up their data? I mean, sort of, I guess, larger macro organizations. And if so, what do those organizations do?
Well, one of the, there's no question that this is not a new problem in oil and gas. And as I mentioned, the OSDU is just one example of an organization that's working hard to try and rationalize the data challenge to enable business transactions to take place. But there are a number of organizations that are going down this path. Just some examples: the PPDM, the Professional Petroleum Data Management Organization, has produced what's called by shorthand the PPDM, the model of data. This is the metadata and how all of the data elements relate to each other. Energistics is another organization that is advocating for the adoption of data standards, technical open data standards, to help the oil and gas industry. The OPC Foundation is another one. And if you went around the world to various oil and gas basins, you'd find lots and lots of organizations that are tackling this question of data standards to enable business to operate more fluidly. The key, though, and I think this is summarized nicely here, is the faster we deal with these adoption of standards, the better it is for everyone in the industry. There's no question about that. But it is slow going because of this huge inertia with the legacy systems and how they're built and designed.
And then at this point, we have taken that data monster and reduced it into, well, a less intimidating set that can be employable for the employees as a tool to better enhance resource output and simplify a lot of communication. So this is only part 1 of the episode. We're going to have to cut it here because things are getting long, and we'll present part 2 later. But from this part, if you had to summarize the most important bits of what we have just discussed, what would you want to highlight?
Well, the critical takeaways for me start from the point of number 1, data quality is critical. Number 2, this question of data and data structure and metadata, and understanding that is an important skill set that needs to be part of the future. When you think about the pace and the growth of data and the range that's mushrooming, that skill set becomes ever more critical. And third is, there is a lot of trivial, obsolete, and redundant data in data sets, and any efforts to remove all of that rot will generate some value down the road. And then finally, I advocate to be quite surgical. Don't boil the ocean. Find the small number of data sets that are going to make a big difference and concentrate on those.
All right, and I think that is where we will close the episode out. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for part 1 of this series. Be sure to subscribe because we're going to build on these ideas. It's going to evolve. It's going to continue to grow. So, as always, plenty of opportunities to grow and learn. We've got Jeffrey's website, plenty of blog posts, his book, Bits, Bytes, and Barrels. If you haven't read it at this point, I can't understand why you haven't. Clearly, there is benefit to reading and growing and moving into this digital age, and you're just being a little bit stubborn. So check that out. You can get physical copies, digital copies, even audiobook copies. I'll be sure to include that. And then we've got Rare Petro on the other side as well, publishing plenty of oil field specific knowledge, markets, how they change, general news on Mondays. Please join us. We'd love to have you. And Jeffrey, anything else you'd like to say before we close out the episode?
No, but good luck with your data journey. It is a critical part of a digital future is to be good at handling data.
All right. Like you said, it's a journey, but join us on this journey. And until we see you next time, take care, everybody.